Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, your host. With us today is military author, game designer, and the editor of Strategy Page, Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us today is columnist, author, and a Strategy Page associate editor, retired Colonel Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Talk a little bit today about how Iran has gone a meddle too far. Jim, you want to get us started off this morning?
Yeah, our latest report on Iraq the other day, I was forced, as it were, not necessarily against my will, but to basically go in and look at all the little things that have been happening in Iraq and Syria, which are linked in many ways, and Turkey, which of course is dealing with the Kurdish, their Kurdish separatists, PKK, etc., uprising, and of course Iran. And what hit me, as it were, as I was going over the piece, before sending it in, was that Iran is losing all over. I mean, let's point out the ways. First of all, in Iraq, the Iranians believe that since the Shia Arab majority in Iraq were able to get themselves empowered, I mean, they're basically running the government. They have 60% of the population, and their votes are counted, maybe sometimes twice, but they don't really need that because they do have, for the first time in centuries, actually probably ever, because the Sunnis have always dominated that area. Mosul, until 1920s, was part of Turkey proper, not the empire, but Turkey. It was taken away after World War I because the Allies didn't want Turkey to get back oil. Kemal had not actually implemented his entire, reform, secularization, as it were, of Turkey. So basically, they felt, hey, these Turks are always coming back, and the last thing we want them to have is a lot of oil. But Baghdad, which was always basically a Sunni city, a very wealthy Sunni city. It's where most of the educated Sunnis, the merchant families, they lived and they thrived. Over the years, Shia moved in, especially once oil was discovered, because there was more work. And Sunnis are educated; they're going to be the bosses, not getting their hands dirty. But the area, present day Iraq, was primarily a Shia majority. The Sunnis always denied that, but when we got in there, we were able to basically get a better sense of how many people there were, what their religious preferences were. It was clear that the earlier CIA estimates were that the Shia were indeed a majority, and that this could cause problems. The West, especially the United States, ignored this problem about the animosity between Shia, Sunni, and Iranians. Because another problem, which again is not politically correct to report, is that the Iranians really despise the Arabs. I mean, you talk about racism in the United States. I mean, people who haven't been overseas, especially to East Asia, or the Middle East, have no idea what real racism or massive, pervasive racism looks like. Soldiers go over there, get a taste of it, but the general public and especially the journalists, just ignore it. The problem is that this is backfiring on the Iranians. They expected that they could strong arm, if necessary, the Iraqis, the Shia Arab government in Iraq, to basically be their, satellite, their subordinate. The Iraqis are pushing away from that, and now the Iranians do have a large chunk of the PMF, the People's Mobilization Forces, the militia, the local militia forces that Iran played a key role in organizing in late 2014 after the ISIL overran Mosul and a lot of Anbar and a lot of northern Iraq. But now, they just 2 weeks ago, the government literally made the PMF part of the army. That means they just aren't basically theoretically patriotic, Iraqis organized and armed by their brotherly, neighbor Iran. They are part of the army, and they are subject to army discipline. Now, this is where you're going to get some scary headlines in the future, because there's already been a couple of run-ins. There was a recently, again, in the last month, there was a run-in between the Presidential Guard and some of these pro-Iranian, PMF units, and there were casualties. And we're probably going to see more of this because the government, as well as the Sunnis in Anbar, most of the Sunnis in Anbar basically, again, rallied to the government to get rid of ISIL. I mean, they did this in 07 or 08 to get rid of Al Qaeda. They didn't learn the lesson, and then of course, an even worse, a harsher form of Islamic radicals came in, ISIL, which is basically led by the remnants of the 08 Iraqi, Al Qaeda, and they're basically done with it. And the big problem out there, there's still some ISIL hiding out in the desert, is the payback attacks. Not so much by the Iranian-backed PMF, but by the Sunni tribes who have scores to settle. A lot of people basically collaborating with ISIL to run that area for 3 years, and that's a payback type situation. Be that as it may, the PMF were supposed to be withdrawn from Anbar as soon as the defeat of ISIL was declared. Now, the truth is, there are still several thousand ISIL, and mainly in Anbar, in eastern Syria, along the Euphrates, or in the desert near the Euphrates River Valley that goes up from Iraq through Syria into Turkey, and north of Baghdad, in Kirkuk province and what have you. And two things are happening here. One, the apparently the Iraqi, the PMF Iranian units, as it were, have been ordered to stonewall, to delay, not pull out of Anbar, and to basically follow the orders of Iran, not the Iraqi government, when it comes to trying to suppress the ISIL threat that still exists. Now, to make things even muddier, I mean, nothing is clean in the Middle East. The Turks are on the warpath, as we reported, in our Syria coverage, and they basically want to have a buffer zone on their border, with their entire border with Syria, and the eastern part of that border is basically occupied by pro-American Kurds, mainly the SDF, and 2,000 American troops. So there's a problem there. But the Kurdish north, at least most of it, the border up there, has the Iraqi Kurds, who have been, over the last 2 decades, remarkably cooperative with the Turks. And the Turks recognize that. So they're not leaning on the Turks up in northern Iraq as much, but they are sending troops in, both in the northeast, where the Iranian, Turkish, and Iraqi borders meet, and in the northwest, Sinjar, that Yazidi, that's basically a heretic Kurdish faction. Heretic in terms of religion, they basically have a form of Islam which is basically pre-Muslim, and they're generally considered heretics by everybody. The Kurds never cared. I mean, that's what the problem with the advantage of the Kurds is, yes, most of them are Muslim, but they don't take it as fanatically. I'm not talking about seriously, but as fanatically as the Arabs do. And that's a big difference. They have sent troops about 10 kilometers into Iraq, but that's the part of Iraq that is now controlled by the government, namely by the PMF militias, including a lot of these Shia militias. And now the Iraqis, the government protested this because the Turks have done this before. But the Turks note that in any area where the Kurds were in control, they could basically, well, let me put it this way. The PKK, these are the Turkish Kurdish separatists, the leftists, whatever. These guys are a nasty piece of work. A lot of people have been killed fighting them. They were never allowed to set up a major base in northern Iraq. I mean, the Kurds would sort of tolerate the Turkish F-16s bombing them, sending in special operations troops to maybe collect information from the bombed sites and what have you. It was all fairly discreet, not large scale. But now, this time, since in October 2017, the Iraqi government settled a dispute that had been going on for years over Kirkuk province, which had traditionally been Kurdish, but that's another story. They drove the Kurds out with a surprise offensive, again led by the Iranian PMF militias. So that bothered the Iraqis because they felt like they were being manipulated, you think, by Iran. And one thing Iraqis in general, whether they be Arab, Kurdish, Sunni, or Shia, they do not want to be played, as it were. I could use a more colorful term, but by Iran, and that's exactly what the Iranians are trying to do. Now, at the same time, the Americans are pointing out, and the Iraqi government has acknowledged this. We were too hasty in 2011 when we wouldn't sign the Status of Forces Agreement, and all the American troops left, except for the ones who could get diplomatic cover, which was a small number. And they regret that, and they're going to change that. Well, of course, after 2014, they signed the Status of Forces Agreement, but we were reluctant to send a lot of troops in there. We have about 5,000 now, and some of them are coming home. But they realize now the problem was not the United States, it was Iran. Well, actually, they got two problems. They got the radical Sunnis, Al-Qaeda and now ISIL, and they've got Iran, which has always been considered the big bully in the neighborhood. That's why the Arabs tolerated the Turks, more or less, in a lot of the Middle East, because they basically kept the Iranians out. At least the Turks were Sunni, and they were respectful of, like the Shia, and they basically took care of the holy places, the Mecca and Medina for the Hajj and what have you. But otherwise, they leave people alone as much as possible. The Iranians don't do that. They want to get into a place, and they will basically really take charge and not be gentle about it. And now that is not getting in the headlines. The Iraqis, I guess the Saudis came up. The Saudis just are resuming a lot of how should I put it, economic relationships, which were severed in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. That in fact they just started letting their airlines from Saudi Arabia commercial service resume into Iraq, and they're trading and they're talking about investing and what have you. This really ticks off the Iranians, but the Shia Iraqi government are sitting down and talking, and imagine what everybody's saying is, look, we're Arabs. 20% of the Saudi population is Shia. They do okay. All right, Bahrain's a problem, but we're not slaughtering them like the Iranians do with their Arab minority. We don't despise them; they are Arabs. There are religious differences, but you got this new crown prince who's letting women drive, letting them walk around with their faces showing. He's liable to have a backlash on that, because this sort of thing was tried in the 60s and 70s by one of his predecessors, and it didn't work out too well. But anyway, the time has changed, and more Saudis are willing to back up this reform attitude, and that means the Arabs who are running, the Shia Arabs who are running Iraq, can basically believe the Sunnis. That they will get a fair deal from the Sunnis, because after 1990, the Saudis basically openly told the Americans, "Don't invade. We need a Sunni dictator there." I mean, that's another reason why he didn't get reported in the West. And we can arrange it. And they thought they could buy enough people to go against Saddam, but Saddam was a wily SOB. That's how he stayed in power, just like the Assads in Syria. And now they've given up on a Sunni strongman to run Iraq. That damn democracy, once it gets in there, it becomes like a permanent condition, whether it works or not. So they have senior officials going up there and basically sitting down with the Iraqis, say, let's make peace, let's make money, and let's keep Iran out. Now, Iran and Turkey are a problem, because the Turks will not listen. They never did listen to Iran. They've been enemies for centuries. And at the same time, Iran is basically in Yemen is not getting the kind of support they hope to get, from Russia and Turkey, and they're losing there because a lot of the rebel coalition, which is led by the Shia Arab minority in Yemen, is falling apart. The Arabs are not willing to take basically not willing to take the personnel launch. That's what affluence does to you. In the old days, they just go in there, take their licks, a lot of martyrs, a lot of glory, and it'd be over. But it's been grinding on, but the rebels are losing, and the Iranians can't stop it. They just recently, fired 7 ballistic missiles, and none of them, hit a target. Those that came close were knocked down by Patriot missiles, which they've been doing regularly. Not one has gotten past the Patriots. Some people point out, well, yeah, the Patriot didn't get this one. Yeah, but that one, basically wasn't going to hit anything of any value. That's what the Israelis use in their Iron Dome system. And now I don't know if we've developed a software patch that does that in Saudi Arabia. But as Austin pointed out to me, our Patriots are getting a lot of practical experience, and it bothers the Iranians no end that a lot of their Arab opponents, in Arabia, have Patriot systems, and they're learning a lot on how you use it, and they're getting confident. Not that they can basically say, bring it on, Iran, because they got plenty of missiles. They could basically saturate, the Arabian targets with hundreds of missiles, and the Patriots wouldn't be able to handle all of them. But the point is that the Arabs are not the kind of pushovers that the Iranians had always hoped they would be. And now they're not only pushing back militarily, fighting each other, which is what's going on in Yemen and Iraq, but they're also, stopping the kind of weapons that the Iranians are threatening Israel with. Now, Israel, that's another thing. The Iranians are in Syria, and they're saying we're going to destroy, Israel, but they're getting no allies. I mean, they're getting some, people saying, well, okay, well, especially the Turks. Turks just ran a thing. Erdogan, the new Sultan of Turkey, but that's another story. They want to lead a crusade, not a crusade, but a coalition to destroy Israel. Now that's mostly talk, and it's mostly for Iran. It's meaningless. The Russians are apparently still telling the Turks, look, we'll back you with this Kurdish thing, but we're not going to take on the Americans, and we're sure as hell not going to take on the Israelis. And one reason for that is a large chunk of the Jewish population in Israel is Russian. We have the Russians easing up and letting their Jews out of Russia in the 80s, and now a lot of them moved back to Jews. But if you claim any connection, in other words, if you were a train car Jew, that's the joke. A lot of non-Jewish, non-religious Jews say that it doesn't make any difference if you say you're not religious, you're not a Jew. If the Semites do what the Nazis did again, they'll look at this, one drop, you're Jewish, you're dead. But the Russians have benefited a lot from the Jewish connection they now have with Israel, and they do the math. I says if you count up who's got what in terms of technical proficiency and economic power and brain power and willingness to do deals, Israel's the guys to be with. They still want to maintain some clout, as it were, with the Arab countries, but they found during the Cold War, this is like ancient history now, but I was much younger kid, and even it was headlines in the United States where the Russians got into the Middle East, and the Arabs played hardball. They cut them off. They basically try and work them for everything they could, and the Russians never forgot that. Now they're trying to get back in there, but as we point out on strategy page, there's no more easy credit. You got to pay cash. We'll send you any kind of weapons you want, but it's cash on the barrel, and otherwise, no goodies. the Russians basically know who they can work with in that situation. So the Iranians make a big, noise about we're gonna basically have a coalition that will crush Israel, but they're getting no allies. The Turks are basically telling them, all right, we'll say this, but as a practical term, we are not going to take on the Israelis. If you Arabs if you want to talk the Arabs into doing it and getting killed in the process, like they've done so many times before, hey, go for it. We don't care for the Arabs either, but we're not as open about it, as you guys are. Plus, we're not religious fanatics. I mean, Erdogan is using Islam. That is not the kind of conservative Islam you see in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and even Jordan, for example. So overall, the Iranians are not winning. We thought they were. They thought they were back in late 2017. But then, bingo, there was massive nationwide demonstrations by people who the religious dictatorship in Iran thought were their allies, thought were their base. Sound familiar? Bingo, all of a sudden they were out there demonstrating, literally saying, get rid of the religious government, the dictatorship. It's technically a democracy, but the senior religious officials have, by the current constitution, a veto power over government decisions and even, I guess, who can run for office. And the Iranians are fed up with that. So the Iranian government, granted, they have their own radical wing, the Republican, what do you call it, the guards, the IRGC, and these are a corrupt, basically, a group of fanatics who are consider themselves a power unto themselves, and as long as they make a mess overseas, which is expensive, which most Iranians understand, they're justified in doing whatever the heck they want. But even the senior religious are not so keen about that anymore. The IRGC, the fanatics in the Iranian government, they get a lot of money. They steal a lot of money. They start talking about, we will keep, religious government going in Iran, and they sort of leave the beep, even if we have to, do something about some stray, senior clerics who don't see things aren't anymore. So they have an internal problem all of a sudden. That was embarrassing. But then they found out, once the neighbors got a scent of that blood, all of a sudden, all the resentments of the Iranians in early 2018 popped up, and now they're basically losing, and they're trying not to admit it, and that gets interesting. So there we are. As I put out earlier, it was a meddle too far. They meddled and they meddled, and bingo, suddenly it's all rolling back on them.
So, overall analysis is spot on. The Iranians have. It's not new that the Iranian government, the Khomeiniist government, the one established by the Ayatollah Khomeini and his cohorts after the 1979 revolution removed the Shah, meddles with its neighbors, its enemies perceived, and enemies potential. Understand that there are instances where there are nations and groups that didn't know they were on the Khomeiniist hit list, and that happened in South America in the 80s and 90s. The relationship to terror attacks and crime, primarily on Israeli targets, but not solely. And there, by the way, some of those incidents, no, there's no hard empirical evidence connecting Iran. There are in several of the more notorious cases, but there they were, and there they are too. If Venezuela, not that being connected to Maduro's government gets you anything, but the Iranians were interested in Chavez, who died, and Maduro replaced him because. Heavens, Venezuela has 300 billion barrels of oil reserve, and the Iranian, one of the things they like to play is their oil price volatility, particularly on the high side. So having a relationship with a wild South American dictatorship that has that kind of oil, or has those kind of oil reserves, is perceptually to their advantage. Now, I went to South America for a purpose. It's because Jim pretty well covered what are the most important aspects of Iranian meddling: Iraq, Syria, Yemen, most noticeable, and certainly the most volatile, because Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting a proxy war, shadow war in Yemen. The Saudis' perception is that's our back door. And the Iranians' perception is Yemen's Saudi Arabia's back door. Jim talked about the racism present. It's not new. You can look. I'll do this from a contemporary angle, even though you can find the evidence historically. Iranian expatriates, American Iranians, will be quite frank about the history of it. With the look, Iranistan. It's Aryanistan. They're the Aryans, and they're 500 BC. They regarded the Semitic Arabs and the Jews, Semites, as inferiors. They're ethnic inferiors. They're cultural inferiors, and that's still present in contemporary Iran. And the Arabs living next door to them know that that's the case, and they resent it, and they've had reasons to resent it. Now, does 500 BC control what goes on in the 21st century AD? It doesn't control it, but it does affect it. And there are these continuities, and that's what Jim was talking about as and he's saying racism. There's a cultural clash there too. The Iranians see themselves as more developed, better educated, more technologically competent, which goes back to Jim's point, which a lot of that is not supposed to talk about it, but yeah, you can say that, hey, the Iranians have legitimate accomplishments to stand on. But now you've got UAE and the Saudis and some of the small some Arab states developing those skill sets with their advanced short-range anti-ballistic missiles. That's what the Patriot PAC-3 is, but also their air forces. Jim wrote something. Actually, he's written this several times about Saudi Air Force experiences in Yemen. Yes, some of the media reports that, well, they missed and in the smart bomb went in the wrong place. All right, that's correct. At the same time, they've gotten a lot of experience in running an air campaign. Yes, the United States Air Force and contractors have helped them, but a lot of the burden of waging this air war, let's say a lot. That is a way to put it, really. The Saudis, Saudi pilots, and the planners associated with them, they've done it. Now, yes, they've had access to their allies, U.S., I'm sure Israeli as well, and the Emiratis have all kinds of access to targeting information. But they're gaining experience, and that's why Jim says the Iranians are noticing that. Well, good. I thought it was interesting, too, though, that Jim brought up the possibility of Iranian saturation missile attack. That's something that Iran flashes every so often. It's not new. They began doing that in the 1980s, saying, well, we'll just blow you Arabs on the other side of the Persian Gulf away with our modern weapons. They did that. For what it's worth, I'll make another point, too. Note how many times the Pentagon's photos don't say Persian Gulf, but say Arab Gulf. there's a battle going on over the name right now. It's been traditionally the Persian Gulf, but Arabs have objected to that for maybe 150 years on it, saying we live on that body of water as well, and I've seen that in some of the Department of Defense photos. That's not the only place that crops up. It's a war that right now Iran still wins, that name war, but you can see the Arabs are fighting back. So to get back to Yemen, Iran apparently thought that they were going to roll in Yemen, and that they were going to have Saudi Arabia's back door and catch Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis and Oman in a bind. Plus, if controlling Yemen, they essentially set up a similar situation of being able to close off the Bab al-Mandab, the entrance from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, in the same way they threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is between the UAE, Oman, and Iran, which is going into the Indian Ocean. A lot of tanker traffic. That goes back to the playing the threaten to close off oil tanker routes and spike the price of oil. They used to do that a lot, as they say many times on for instance, Instapundit, have you hugged a fracker today? The American fracking revolution, and also what the Canadians are in on this, has greatly reduced the effectiveness of the Iranian, OPEC, and Russian oil price manipulation game. But now I'll point out some other places too that Iran's meddling has not produced the political and diplomatic results they wanted, or really increased its influence. What it's done is kind of the way, the picture Jim painted is a lot of its blowback on Iran with ticking everybody off. They've exploited their Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and Al-Quds, their special forces, and intelligence terror arm, Lebanese Shia communities in Africa, and also in South America. There are indications that they tried to pull the same in Central America, but we're not anywhere near as adept at it, and use them as routes to both the intelligence sources or scattered bases to help, in some cases, Sunni extremist groups rattle sub-Saharan African countries, engage in criminal activities, and serve as a potential way to destabilize their enemies in Western Europe and North America, and heaven forbid, their potential enemies in East Asia, who depend on African resources. Now that sounds outlandish, but the fact is then they've done it. They haven't been very successful at it, but you can see the trace of them wanting to try it. Why? Well, go back to an attitude that Jim sketched, which is, well, we can do this and we want to control it. They really do want to control it. And that has not paid off. Now, there's one other place, too, that they've ticked off a lot of people. And Jim got to it right at the end of his analysis. That's back home. Their domestic situation is not is brittle. Let's put it that way. And maybe one reason they meddle. I think it's one reason they want nuclear weapons, is because then they show I'm talking about the regime. We're big shots, kind of a North Korea analog there, and there are some other analogs between the Khomeini regime and the Kim regime in North Korea. Very different context, but there is that similarity. Look back, late 80s, early 90s. There were Iranians, so quote unquote, and they are moderates because they had experience in Western Europe and U.S. or other parts of the world, saying, "Hey, eventually this radical tide will crest." Except it didn't, and that was really over the Desert Storm time too, when they the world and the Iranians were shocked by the success of the American high-tech warfare. But that didn't happen. That didn't. The moderation, it didn't happen. They started cracking down, and then the big threat comes is when a real moderate Ayatollah Khatami. That's right, Jim. And I don't have but the fellow who was also a scholar and had studied, had a PhD, I believe, from a German university, and he ran and got over 70% of the vote, and he wasn't supposed to. And he got reelected. So this is where the Iranian government practicing, I'm talking about the Khomeiniist narrative warfare. See, we have a democracy. Well, except they don't. They have that religious council makes all the decisions. But here they had the exact kind, and the man's a cleric. He of moderate got elected, 60, almost 70% of the vote. And then, of course, he got reelected. Then they changed the rules completely, which leads into the 2009 Green Movement, sometimes Green Revolution, but Green Movement. You remember that? That's June 2009. Really, it comes out. Lots of demonstrations. Not so many casualties. There were some, but there's also a split, and some Revolutionary Guard Corps officers are for this. It's almost an opening up and reform, except it doesn't happen. And yes, the Obama administration was very slow to respond to that. Got shut down. Then we go forward to, well, last year it happened again. It wasn't as extensive as the 2009 demonstrations and protests, but it's back, and the Ayatollahs know it. They know it, and that in some ways, how do you forward democratic reform within Iraq? It's a puzzle, but to use Jim's language, if the Ayatollahs aren't winning, aren't losing in Tehran, they're not winning, and it's another problem for them. I think that pretty well covers it, though.
Right.
I bet we've been kind of around the world, haven't we, Jim?
Oh, dear. Well, Iran is, so you got to chase him.
Yeah. Right. One of the interesting things that happened to me at the start of the first Gulf War, it was during one of my insane moments where I was teaching full time. One of my students was from Iran, but he would introduce himself as being Persian because he wanted to make sure that, first of all, he didn't, that there was still a bad taste about Iran and the hostage situation even 10 years later. But also he wanted to differentiate himself from the Arab students. So he was Persian.
Look. I'm sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Right.
I was going to say that, look, Persian comes from their language, Farsi and the like, and that's the route of that, as I understand it, is that is the way the Greeks described them, and of course it influences Western nomenclature. But they call themselves the Aryans, and that's and you can see that in their literature. It's certainly the common explanation for it. But I think that's funny that your student student did that, he obviously had reasons. So
Right.
Yeah, and then
All right.
as I put one last thing, as I pointed out in some of our other coverage, the Iranians or the Persians, they were way ahead of anybody else in terms of military technology. They, for example, had plate armor, several hundred BC, and they had the what compound bow like the Mongols used, and they
Right.
were basically unbeatable on the battlefield. So it's not they're just not blowing hot air. There is something to back it up. Except now they might have nukes, and that's a little different from plate
well,
armor and compound bows.
another thing that we're good at before they became antiquated was chariot warfare. They made a
Yeah,
big deal out of it, and that's look, the chariot wagon warfare, armed wagon warfare like that. It's still a sophisticated operation. And I'm not saying the weaponry is, but it to pull it off. And of course, by the fourth, third century BC, the age of the chariot's over. But that's something that the Iranians were successful at in the first 500 years of the first millennium BC. I know the attack is, hey, you guys are being historicists. This is old stuff, but it still shapes cultural perceptions, and I am. I'll tell a quick personal anecdote, Dan, that in some ways complements this, without saying who this is. PhD, Iranian, long time in the United States, virulently anti-Khomeinist, doesn't like the Shah either. But in discussing the subject of Iranian technical superiority over the Arabs, he'll get a little smile and he says, "When do you want to start? Give me the year." And that is funny. But all right, this is a very intelligent, obviously, and the fellow has, he's got national, international recognition in his field, and I know several of his colleagues happen to be Jordanian Palestinian Arabs who also PhDs in this. So this is they'll sit. I have not spoken with them on it, but I know that they talk about it. And he says, when do you want to start? Give me the time frame, and it's a wink, and because he knows the same stuff I know, and he wants to have nothing to do with it. That's why, and like a lot of immigrants to the United States, they won't have anything to do with it. But the reason they won't have anything to do with it is because it complicates solving problems. In this case, it complicates solving problems everywhere, but certainly in the complicated Middle East.
Right. Well, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time. Hopefully, we won't have as long a break as we did this last time, and we'll be back soon.
All right, bye. Guys.
Bye.